But coming to the first panel discussion that we will be doing today, which is going to delve into a lot of these unanswered questions, we're kind of looking to understand better how, as artificial intelligence is moving from assistant to perhaps shaping our decision making, what is going to happen to aspects like trust, accountability from the system, as well as something more cognitive and psychological like human judgment. This particular session asks how we build systems that are capable, trustworthy, and actually strengthen human agency rather than diminishing it. Questions of privacy, prediction, and the public good sit right here. I'd like to welcome our panel, Dr. Pavan, of course, Professor Subhashis Banerjee, who heads the Center for Digitalization, AI and Society at Ashoka University. He taught computer science at IIT Delhi for over 3 decades, where he held the Microsoft and Nareen Gupta chair professorships. And his work spans computer vision, distributed systems, and the privacy and governance of India's large digital identity systems. Dr. Kailash Nadh is the Chief Technology Officer at Zerodha, where he built and leads the technology behind India's largest retail stockbroker. He holds a PhD in artificial intelligence and linguistics and is a prolific contributor to the global tech community, having authored a substantial body of free and open source software. I'd also personally recommend that you check out his website, it's quite fascinating. These are joined, of course, by our moderator, Gopikrishnan Nair, the Associate Director of Stratcoms at CSBC. Please join me in welcoming them.
Hello. Yeah, hope everyone can hear us. Okay, so I think, Pavan, before I start, really thank you for setting the stage for this first panel with that wonderful talk. It really delved into a lot of the things that we have discussed even at CSBC over the last many months. And I'm really glad that you ended on those unanswered questions, because those are some things that we'll also probably get to talk in this through this panel. So just to begin with, over the last few years, AI has quietly become something that's part of our everyday lives, right? It writes our emails, it recommends what we watch, it helps doctors diagnose diseases, and it even assists governments in delivering public services. And in fact, even the recent World Cup, it's actually called the first AI World Cup, and where AI is being used in everything from player performance to actually even refereeing. So like it's a little, think about that a little bit. But I think one of the most important questions is, what does it mean for us? In the sense that, how do we ensure these systems, which are already with us, which are systems that we are using every day, how do we ensure that these systems expand human capability rather than replace it? Right? How do you preserve agency? How do you build trust in trusting the AI? And how do you make sure people remain meaningfully in control? Right? So to explore these questions, I'm honestly very honored to have a panel of actual experts from across the board. And I'm really and I'm really glad to delve right in. Right? So maybe to begin with, I have a question for all three of you. So today there's an understandable excitement about AI, right? And we're using AI in everything, including this. In the whole session is on it, right? And people are trying to apply to almost every problem there is. But are there or should there be any red lines, particularly when it comes to development and public policy? And are there decisions or domains where AI simply should not play a central role? And if so, why? Subhashi, yes, would you like to start?
Um, I think that AI systems are great, right? They're probably the best that I've ever seen in my entire technical career. But I personally don't think that they're ready as yet for automated use, fully automated use at all, or any kind of decision-making use. Part of it, Pawan has already spoken about. They're not explainable. I would say that the bigger, larger AI systems are not explainable at all. And there are results that say that fairness is also impossible. That's a technical impossibility. So given these two caveats, they are probably good only for personal use. And personal use by discerning users, right? And personal use by users who can figure out the right from the wrong. And those are the only use that are possible right now as of.
I agree with the I agree with what you said, Professor. There's there's the technical dimension, but a more interesting and deeper, and maybe a slightly more sinister dimension is the human dimension. And agency is a very loaded, washed out, overloaded, cliched word at this point. Uh, what has been the state of agency in the age of technology in general? If you, we've all experienced these instances walking into a government office and somebody says the server is down, or this is what the system says, or the system times out. So technology over the last 2 decades or so, through rapid digitization, the technology has, humans have used technology to add layers and layers of obfuscation to erode agency by design. You can just offload agency and somebody can just say, I don't know, that's what the system says. And it's not just governments, it's private corporations, it's pretty much all institutions. And this was with good old classical non-AI technology, simple systems and dashboards and internet. Now, what happens when you have AI, where it literally can't be explained? It's a black box, and the people in positions of power and decision making can just point at this system, which is a magical black box, and say that I don't know. That's what the system decided. That's what they've always been doing. So I am, yes, the technical side. It's easier to debate. I feel it being a black box. It's easier to dissect. It's easier to have a discourse on. But what about the societal structures and the nature of power itself? The way it's going to use this is the bigger worry.
Um, no, I completely, I mean, I think both the earlier comments, I think, are very valid. Uh, we are nowhere near the explainability of AI. And Kailash brought up a very interesting, he highlighted the obscurity of the word agency. And I often wonder whether human beings ever had agency. I mean, there's this, sort of broader debate, right? I mean, in philosophy, between free will and determinism. Free will school of thought would have you believe that you are the author of your own choices, whereas the determinists believe that all the choices and all the decisions that you make are consequences of antecedent prior conditions. If you had a great lunch, you might act in a particular way, and if you had a bad lunch, you would act in a different way, and so on. Right? So, having admitted to the idea that we may never have had free will, the question then really becomes: does AI diminish our free will any more than what used to happen before AI? And that's an important question. And AI seems to do that in one particular way, and that is with the advent of the internet and with the fragmentation of attention, the number of signals that come to us are many more than they used to be. I mean, in the past, I used to be able to take a walk, and the antecedent conditions that would impact my decisions were fewer. But right now, my attention is being taken up by many, many more signals, right? And so, in some sense, my cognitive abilities, and this is a project, I'm hoping to, Kailash and I and Sneha, we're planning to work on. What happens when our brain gets crowded by too many things, when we get cluttered? So, I don't know if we have any more free will or any less free will than we always did in the past, but it certainly is the fact that AI is beginning to impact human decision making in a different way. And I think we need to be guarded about that. And I think we do need to start thinking about how we draw a red line there. And another red line that I would ab initio state is that uh, AI should not be connected with any weapons or you know, any unintermediated systems which can potentially kill other humans. That's one starting premise that I would start.
I think we already started crossing the red line, but okay. uh, but okay, building on the line which on the concept of human agency, Kailash, I just wanted to ask, so prediction systems and AI is becoming ever more powerful, right? So in this, and as these things are becoming more powerful, how do we ensure that these systems strengthen human agency rather than replace it? Is there a mantra that you would think which would help? And also, is there it should be where should we draw the line between assistance and autonomy?
I mean, going back to what Pawan said, have human beings ever strengthened their own agency or work towards strengthening each other's agency? So I don't know. I mean, I find it very difficult to separate AI as a construct and humanity or the human societal framework as another construct where they're discrete. And we think this is near perfect. We figured it all out, and there's this new thing. How do we incorporate? But that's not the reality. The human construct is as messy as it has always been. So it's very difficult. I think it's nice to talk about things like how do we use AI safely? How do you incorporate it into our workflows? How do we decide, make proper, safe decisions with AI? I don't think anybody knows, and I don't think there's a formula or a framework. We don't. We haven't even begun to understand the cognitive effects of these systems on a very personal level. Forget at a much higher, geopolitical decision-making level. So I think I would say that we must be deeply skeptical of our own self-assurance that we have this, we are going to figure this out. So it's been very difficult for me to even think about any of this clearly. So I'm confused.
Subhashish, would you like to add?
Yes, I agree, and I think that the modern AI systems, they're particularly complex, which makes the problem harder, and and we make mistakes. The way we think of AI is just fraught with errors. We have a system. Take the large language models, for example. So we have got a system trained for coherence, and we often demand correctness and justice out of it. Right? It's not an AI is failing, but it's a human failing. In the optimization that we did, we never put correctness even as a parameter, and yet we constantly talk about using it in systems that demand correctness as an answer. So the problem is human. The problem is complex. I agree with you.
And Pavan, would you?
I just wanted to say what Kailash just said earlier, which is I'm confused. I think it's a great, that admission is, I think, wonderful. That self-awareness, I think, is critical. And I think it is important for society to stop and say, we really don't know. I mean, this is a question for which we don't have an answer yet. Posing that question itself is a great starting point. So thank you, Kailash.
Great, absolutely. And Subhashish, on what you spoke about the inference element, just delving a little deeper. So much of the debate around AI has been focused on privacy and data protection, right? But in your work, you argue that the bigger challenge is actually the quality of inferences that AI makes, right? And even when the data has been lawfully obtained and when the data is technically accurate, but what are the quality of that inference? Why is validity of inference such an important idea? And why do you think we are asking the wrong questions when we try to regulate AI?
Data protection, as Pavan mentioned earlier, GDPR has primarily thought of privacy as secrecy, right? As data protection, and privacy is anything but, right? Privacy is about agency. Privacy is about self-determination. Privacy is about uh, protecting oneself against um, others controlling you in many ways. And computer science, especially when it comes to AI, does not have the techniques to guarantee any of that. So traditional methods of privacy address only data leakage um, and probably profiling to some extent by purpose limitation. Not in a technologically verifiable way, but at least the principle of what you want to do is clear, right? Now, when it comes to AI, I think that the bigger question is unleashing an unreliable system on you, and that violates your privacy, very seriously. So I would think that reliability is the biggest concern with AI, and how to think of reliability. There are these there is this validity problems, that what applications of AI are valid and what applications of AI are invalid. And I find that this is turning out to be surprisingly difficult to figure out. For example, take about screening job applications with AI, right? Take that as an application. Now that has a construct validity problem. Now you are assuming that you're not measuring my integrity, you're not measuring my creativity, you are measuring some projections of it into some numbers, maybe my CGPA and some quantified experience, and then you are judging me by using population level data, that how others have behaved. You're using that to predict how I will behave, and that has a serious construct validity problem. This is true of all recommendation systems. You are using a proxy that doesn't really represent the true thing that you want to measure, right? So, for example, if you're using my clicks to figure out my interest, right? And there is a gap between the two. So, similarly, I have been reading a lot of papers in top class journals like Science and Nature that are coming up that are saying that an AI system performs better than a doctor in a diagnosis setup. Now, when you look deep, I think that all of those papers have major interpretation issues. Now, you're looking at a data where the diagnosis is clear, you're giving test results, and so on and so forth. And then you're asking a system like Claude, what is the diagnosis? And it's coming out with slightly better performance. But look, a doctor prescribed that test, right? So he started with a clean slate. Uh, so those measurements protocols are all incorrect. And you're also looking at, say, things like hallucination rate to say measure AI safety for a doctor. Now, look, hallucination is not the only problem, but the subtle mistakes like using uh, over prescription of medicine or using standards which are outdated for prescription. So you're not measuring all of those. So these have construct validity problems not only in application but also in evaluation. And then I think Pawan also talked about um, correlation and causation, right? So you're often trying to figure out systems. So we built a system during COVID. There's a very young girl, a second year student, who built a system for pneumonia detection. And she used Ames data and she claimed that she has 95% accuracy. And then we looked at it, we figured out that all x-rays that were taken in the supine position, she's calling pneumonia. And anything that was taken in the erect position, she was calling good. And that gave 95%. Anybody who could not stand up to be x-rayed was very ill, right? So you're picking up a wrong proxy to make a high accurate predictions. And these kinds of problems are common. And Julia Pearl has illustrated, this problem adequately. There's also this external validity problem. So for example, we also have developed a breast cancer system and deployed at Ames. Now, breast cancer detection system. Now, you have used certain data set, that works in one hospital. There's no guarantee it'll work in another hospital. The fat content, the food habits, almost any shift can cause a change in data distribution and so on and so forth. So these are things that you have to be aware of before you make those applications valid. So I don't think that the articulation of the validity and measurements are given enough attention. And there are all kinds of wrong assumptions that are being made while deploying AI systems. And these have to come into a regulation, whether it's a privacy regulation, I'm not sure, but some kind of a regulation for AI application.
Could I add something to that? It's interesting that you brought up the example of hiring. Uh, Recently, I think last week, this very large tech hiring global firm open sourced their LLM-enabled CV resume screening system, saying we've open sourced it, we're fully transparent, etc., etc. It's reasonably sophisticated. It reads a resume, it has prompts, has this person volunteered X, Y, Z, etc. It's very subjective. Humans prompted it. but it also looks at the links. It crawls the LinkedIn profile. It pulls that information. It looks at somebody's portfolio. So it's not just textual analysis. There's some reasonable sophistication there. Now, because they open sourced it, lots of people out there in the tech community, open source developers, they started testing it out. And what has been found and become rather scandalous is that every time you run it against a resume, it gives a different result. First time you run it, it says 90%, whatever their metric, whatever they call it. You run it again, it becomes 60%. You run it again, it becomes 72%. LLMs are fundamentally non-probabilistic systems. And in this tool chain that they've created, there's a thing called temperature. It's a technical LLM term. The higher the temperature, the more creative an LLM becomes, its output. The wilder and more unpredictable it becomes. So they'd set the temperature to 0.1, or some really low value, where you're supposed to get rather deterministic outputs. Despite all of that, this is the outcome. Now, the organization, the company that put it out there didn't have the self-awareness to even realize that, because they'd been using this in their hiring system, and now the community has demonstrated that it's a wholly unreliable, completely flawed system. Now, when we speak of decision-making, this is the kind of decision-making that is being incorporated everywhere in the world. Whoever is incorporating LLMs into decision-making, it's basically this. There's going to be a bunch of prompts, like read this document, read this insurance claim, etc., etc. And feeding that into a fundamentally non-deterministic system. And who even knows how an LLM works? The people who have created LLMs, and this is rather new technology, right? Brand new practically, and everything's changed in the last 12 months. Even the people who have created these feats of engineering, wonderful feats of engineering, they do not know how it actually produces what output it produces. And yet you see industry, governments, everyone, everywhere in a race to adopt AI, to give agency to agencies, to, I don't know, efficiency, efficacy. It's literally a black box. And yet there's this race. Like Professor said, the assumptions, the human assumptions are flawed. It's a wonderful piece of technology. It's almost like black magic. But every single assumption humans seem to have in trying to understand it, use it, incorporate it at all levels, from personal to the highest levels of statecraft, seems to be fundamentally wrong. And it's too early.
Uh, just one line on it. It seems I was speaking to a few students the other day, and it seems to be that students are using Claude to apply, and HRs are using Claude to kind of go through it and review. So it's kind of going in that way right now. But also staying within the realm of regulation, Pavan, I also wanted to ask, do you have any thoughts on, is there any other critical elements that should be kept in mind while thinking of regulating AI? You ask the lawyer.
Yeah, I get asked this question because I used to be a lawyer and I was a pretty lousy one. So you'll have to bear with the inadequate response that I will produce. I do think that regulation is critical. Regulation is critical in one major regard, and that is in terms of the application of antitrust laws in thinking about the consolidation that's happening within the AI space. You know, one of the things that you need to think about is this whole business of the trade-off between competition and consolidation, right? I mean, when companies cluster and they become oligopolistic, then consumer welfare is brought down, or could potentially be brought down. I mean, it's not to say that you can't have a monopolistic kind of situation where consumer welfare is high. You can, but it is also likely that when there's high degree of consolidation, it can also potentially be used in a wrong way, to the detriment of the consumer. So, technology is an outcome of the balance between two competing ends. On one hand, you need to incentivize innovation, right? You need to allow people to think freely, to be rewarded for their investment into R&D and so on. And intellectual property is not necessarily the best way. I mean, empirical economics will tell you that IP has been overstated. But there are other ways in which you can promote technology. Peer group reputation. I mean, there's this wonderful paper written by Jean Tirole and Josh Lerner at Harvard, and they started off with this question as to why do people even contribute to the public goods of open source? It's not intellectual property, but it's peer group reputational benefits which drive people to contributing to these. So you have an alternative system which can lead to innovation. And there's a lot of empirical work in the economics of innovation which would tell you that. So you need a system that will not paralyze innovation, but simultaneously you also need to have a balancing regulatory mechanism, because there are likely to be market failures, which will allow, uh, you know, which will not allow a diminution of consumer welfare. And that's a balance, and that balance is an evolving balance. So I think it's high time that our government and our civic society even starts thinking about it. And a good starting point is, like Kailash said, we don't know. The admission of we do not know prevents us from uncritically accepting, technical inventiveness without paying some attention to the causes for concern.
Great.
Sorry, long answer. I told you, I warned you, I'm a terrible lawyer. Um,
Okay, but
that's why I became a law professor, as one does when you're terrible at practice.
okay, but okay. Coming back on actually taking the conversation a little back to the discussion that we were talking about, the unanswered questions, and specifically about the word trust, right? So again, even Kailash, you spoke about how it's a black box, and for so many reasons and more, it's really hard to, in some sense, to trust AI, right? And maybe rightfully so. Maybe we shouldn't. But yeah. But I also wanted to ask a question: is there what will it take to actually make people trust AI more? What will it take to make AI more trustworthy? And when these systems get things wrong, is there a way to make the system and not the firm, the brand, but the system in itself a little more accountable? Pavan, do you want to start?
I think we should. I'd rather that. How do you shift trust from the individuals who make the AI to the AI itself?
Um,
Is
you
it
know,
possible at all?
yeah, so if a system is explainable, it's trustworthy. But if it is not explainable, it is not trustworthy. Is not true. For example, an aeroplane is also not explainable. There is no mathematical equation that will um, that will conclusively establish why an aeroplane should fly. Yet we trust it. We trust it because repeated use, repeated iteration, fixing have got certain amount of stability out here. So I think to get similar kind of trustworthy into AI systems, we need an understanding of its nature, right? And right now, I think that among the people who want to use it, that understanding is incomplete. So, a transparent system is an AI system is one where you articulate why you expect it to work, and what is its threat model, what are its risks, why and in what circumstances it may fail. So right now you're using AI systems without any of this articulation, and I think that articulating these as precisely as possible in terms of you know what is the distribution shift you're expecting, what is the causal versus spurious correlation that you're looking for, what is the construct validity problem, is it likely to be fair, or to what extent unfair. So I think that the articulating all this is the first step towards building trust. Now once you articulate, maybe some of these AI applications will not be possible at all, but what will be possible will be trustworthy.
I have to disagree with your question itself. You said, how do we make people trust AI? What should we do to make AI trustworthy? Where does that assumption come from? Where does that premise come from? Why should people trust AI? Why should there be a conversation on how to make AI trustworthy? LLMs, when we say AI, these days we are specifically referring to LLMs as a class of technology. I mean, the entire thing is barely 5 years old. and the way we see it, use it, we've come to understand it, barely 24 to 12 months old. And here we are in a panel discussion, figuring out or discussing how to make humans trust AI. I think we shouldn't. Maybe never ever. We haven't even resolved the fundamental questions and problems of human trust, trust between communities and castes and societies. And here we are trying to shoehorn in trust for a feat of engineering that showed up 24 months ago. I really like LLMs. I use them every day. They're a very powerful tool. But some of these questions and assumptions, we seem to have taken for granted that it's here, it's going to be here forever, it's going to be here for good. And just as the professor was saying, at a more pragmatic level, reliability is a thing, predictability is a thing. But again, when we say LLMs, we were referring to the state-of-the-art models and AI systems that very large private corporations are creating and maintaining and distributing, and also pulling back at at whatever at somebody's whim. And these systems change overnight. For the black boxes to begin with, but the maker of the black box can tune a knob and change its behavior in very overt or subtle ways overnight, and you can't even know. The world hasn't really reached a point where we have powerful AI systems that you can self-host, that are open source, that you can scrutinize, you can understand, and over a period of time build familiarity, like you could do with you can do with an aeroplane. We are not there yet. So I would argue for cultivating a distrust and skepticism of AI at a very large global societal level. It just doesn't make logical sense otherwise.
No, trust is a loaded word, and I think institutionalizing at least a little amount of mistrust, I think, is important for society, right? I mean, it's only when you don't trust some things adequately that a process of inquiry begins. If you were to trust completely, then you would, trust is fundamentally about becoming vulnerable with restricted information. And so, in other words, trust should not degenerate into blind faith either. And that, I think, is an important distinction to be made. But having said that, I think trust, now I'm sort of wearing the behavior science hat. Trust is variant based on context. You can trust somebody for something, but you don't need to trust the same person for a different thing. I would take, for instance, a classical example that is often used in behavior science. If person A lends money to person B, you can trust person B to return, or person A lends a car to person B. Now, you can trust B in either of two ways. B knows how to drive the car well and not crash it. So it's basically a competence-based trust. And the other is B is not morally responsible to run away with the car. And the funny thing about trust is there seems to be an inverse relationship between competence-based trust and moral turpitude-based trust. So when somebody is highly skilled, you want that skill, much like a partner that you want to marry, but the person has many exit options, so you don't have enough to trust the person. So you want a beautiful husband or wife, but you're seeking to optimize between the exit options and the attractiveness of the person, right? And so it becomes a very complex production function in terms of trust. Now, extending that to a machine then becomes even more complex. I mean, Kailash, I think, is absolutely spot on. We haven't even figured it out in terms of human beings. I mean, trust has been studied by sociologists, for instance, who try to understand how gangs recruit, right? You have gangs in Los Angeles and they need to trust somebody because trust is the core essential feature of that. Why? Because you can't enter into a contract that is enforceable by legal authorities in case that there's defection, right? So in some sense, gangs, there truly is honor among thieves. If you and I were to decide to rob a bank together, the only thing that prevents you or either of us from defecting is not a contract that is protected by a formal set of institutions, but it has to be necessarily be based on trust, right? So we haven't really figured that out, right? So unless an AI system tattoos itself and demonstrates that it has fewer exit options, we may not be able to trust it. But how do AIs tattoo themselves? That's a
Unanswered question, sir.
Sorry, I mean, I couldn't help but uh, I'd like to just a thought experiment using the aviation example. And this is a very exaggerated example to prove a point. In the early 1900s, I don't know when Kitty Hawk flew, when the Wright brothers made the first flying machine that really flew. 1903. For centuries, I mean, for centuries, so many millennia, humans had tried to make flying machines with bird wings and whatnot. You had Da Vinci's helicopter, or a prototype, whatever, which was recorded in history. In 1903, the first flying machine actually flew. Now imagine within 12 to 24 months, there were panel discussions saying agency in the age of aviation, and the entire world, industry, society, governments were all pro-aviation, saying we must adopt aviation ASAP. We saw what happened within just 20 years, right? Kitty Hawk it was rendered a toy in less than a decade, and aviation leapfrogged. But did the entire world overnight, within months, rewire into a frenzy to adopt, to make people trust aviation or Kitty Hawk? So Kitty Hawk and LLMs, like I said, exaggerated comparison, but I would still find it apt as a thought experiment.
And I must say, it's refreshing to have a tech leader, also be advocating for taking a little bit of assault when you're talking about AI. So,
no. I think it's important to bring up an earlier point that Subhashish was making, and that is, he was alluding to this idea that we don't really have a complete causal understanding of how airplane wings generate lift. I mean, they talk about Bernoulli's principle and they talk about Newton's third law as being co-jointly responsible for the upward vector, but that really, you don't have complete sense of
Course
that.
explanation.
What's that?
That's a course explanation.
Correct. That's a course. I mean, you have the Navier-Stokes equations and so on, but we don't have a complete causal understanding of how that lift is generated, and yet all of us get into airplanes right now. So clearly trust is being generated by alternative means, right? And that's an interesting thing. So trust is essentially a systems one kind of a function, which doesn't necessarily depend on systems two. And the mere fact that it becomes a systems one kind of a production event then makes it very difficult for us to systematize the production of it. How do we go about doing it? So we have to start learning from gangsters who know how to recruit by base by trusting people uh, without the luxury of institutional mechanisms to protect their contracts against defection.
okay. And coming to one last question for everybody on the panel. If you could embed just one value into every AI system there is, right, which would also be built over the next 20 years, what would that be and why? Subhashish, would you like to start?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I think AI systems are what they are, right? They are large scale parameter optimization problems. And they're amazing. If you had asked me 5 years back, can there be LLMs? I would have answered no. And so I'm totally surprised by them. I would reiterate that the problem with AI is not with the systems at all. The problem is how people use them, right? And some of them are quite mind-boggling. That governments and corporations, the way they think that they can use an AI system. For example, I'll bring up an example of this question of fairness, right? There are theorems in computer science that says if the underlying data is unfair, there is no way you can have fairness. That's an impossibility. That's a technical impossibility. The feasible space is null. Uh, Yet we have corporations that are talking about mitigation systems, throwing in a term out there. These things are not going to work. So you have to make a normative or a political choice about what happens. So I think that you cannot transfer your insecurities to an AI system, right? And I think that that's what you have to resisted the first go.
I have to apologize to you because I seem to have a problem with all of your questions. See, value is a human construct. So you have LLM's data by its transformers, whatever the software engineering artifact that we've created. When we have this human concept and construct of value, and like I said, it's been like 24 months, just about, right? LLMs started doing what they do. To even think that we can imbibe the value in the human sense into whatever that is, I think we shouldn't make that assumption. I wouldn't. There's this word alignment that all the AI people use. The LLM makers use. Maybe that is a more appropriate, slightly technical term where you have a large language model, it communicates, and the people in charge fine tune it in such a manner that it exhibits some behavior. We may infer value from it, a value like fairness or non-violence or whatever. That is just behavior. It's just performance. So you can't imbibe human values into an LLM. That concept, that idea doesn't make technical or philosophical or neurobiological or cognitive sense, I would say.
Just a quick, for any entity or any human being or anybody to have a value, you need intentionality, right? Now, for us to attribute intentionality to a machine is hard. We may be willing to suspend our disbelief and pretend that it has intentionality, and that's how we speak to AI. But underlying is this phenomena that they don't have intentionality. So in the absence of intentionality, how do you imbue it with any value? Right? So we might need to readjust our apparatus of disbelief. But if we are willing to, delude ourselves into believing that they have intentionality and then attribute value, then that's a tall order.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. On those golden words, I think we're running a little short of time. So, Andita, thank you guys so much for coming for this panel. It's been really wonderful. And I hope you catch the speakers during lunch.